Hi friends, welcome to another episode of Cosplay Vicar. This is another little update video on my R2. A few people had been asking me how I was getting on. Some people asking me if it was finished yet. This is going to be a long project. This is not going to be finished anytime soon. But I thought I could give you a bit of an update on where we were. And I particularly want to talk about finishing and painting of 3D parts. So I want to talk about how I've gone about getting the finish on R2, where I'm up to so far. Now, when I'm done, R2 will look beaten up. I want to go for a Star Wars Episode 3 kind of feel / Episode 4. So, dirty, beaten up kind of R2. So this is where I'm up to. Body's printed and a lot of the doors are printed. I'm working on the doors at the moment. I thought I would show you how I go about getting the finish on 3D printed doors. These are ready to print. Ready to paint. I've already started exploring the hinges and putting the hinges on. I need some more white paint to do this. The process on the doors is exactly the same as the process on the body. And there's some tools that I've used I just think are a must if you're doing any 3D printing and you're doing any form of 3D printing that needs clean up and then sanding, priming and painting. There are some tools that I would really recommend. So I've put a little box together because this was using a 3D printer box. A few things that I found really helpful in this whole process. Number one, let's talk about these. I think if you are going to be doing any form of cleanup on a 3D printed part that's used any form of stilts or something to rafts to help you adhere to the bed, or for any of those parts that are kind of have got overhangs, these are a necessity, and these are just a little set of metal tools. And what's beautiful is they come with lots of different shapes, so you can obviously do slightly different things. So when it comes to clean up of some of these straight edges, this is just perfect. You can get in there and you can do that cleanup, and you're going to have a nice clean edge off the back of that. And then because we're working with a lot of these grooves in here, while you're doing filler priming or you're using any form of filler, they're going to get clogged up. So you're going to need to keep cleaning them out. And actually a little sharp tool like this is absolutely fantastic. So I would say these cost me £9 on Amazon, very very cheap, but they're really worthwhile. You keep working with them, and they're great for getting to those hard to reach areas. So I think a little set of tools like this really are a must, because if not, you just cannot get into some of those hard to reach areas. And I think particularly with R2, there's some bits that you think, I just want to get in there, I want to clean that little bit up. Okay, what else have we got in here? Tool-wise, I think one of the things, particularly now working on the legs, which that's a whole other episode, but when you start having to put some pieces together of the R2, you're having to tap things in place. You have to push something in and tap it in place. And having a little hammer that's got a rubber end and a plastic end, I think is an absolute necessity. If you are gluing two pieces together then wanting to get a clean seam, sometimes just tapping with a hammer just allows two pieces to kind of fit together or squeeze together. So I'd say a little mallet like this with a plastic end and a rubber end, that has got me through some sticky situations where I'm thinking, is this actually going to go in? So actually when it comes to filling and priming, people go bonkers for expensive Bondos and things. I've just been using an all-purpose filler suitable for paintwork, walls, wood, the works. And I've been using this for years on all of my 3D printing of props. What's so good about this is you can put a little bit on your finger and you can kind of just massage it into an area, dries really quick, sand, and actually you can get rid of some of those horrible little print lines really quite quickly. So a cheap filler primer, this cost me £4.95 from Tower DIY, local East End shop here, and I just nip in, pick up another one of those, and been very, very happy with the quantity and the quality of that product. When a print comes straight off the bed, I tend to hit it with a really rough. Um, this is a 40 gauge P40, really rough sandpaper, because what I find is if I can knock off some of those edges quite quickly, particularly large flat areas, go over one of these, it kind of roughs up the surface and it then lays a foundation for me to actually go in then with things like these sanding blocks. Now I have a box down here, I'll show you in a minute, of my sandpaper box and other bits and pieces in there. And yes, I use regular sandpaper, but actually when you come to wanting to get into some of these square grooves, particularly on the doors, these little blocks are insanely good, and can't more highly recommend these. And I've got these in. This is a 220. What are these? This is a 60, 150. I've got many different ones of those, and I found those really quite useful. Another tool that I found really useful is just keeping old credit cards. Oh, this is an old Starbucks card. So when you come to wanting to put the filler on large areas, I found using a card just to smooth it in really helpful. So I keep a stack of these old cards, coffee shop cards and that kind of thing, bank cards that I can then just use for using. Yes, you can buy tools to do it. There's nothing better than a card. And the thing is, you can cut them up then. And if you want to get some filler into a particular area, you can cut that card to just get what you need. So can't more highly recommend that. Then, so like these parts here, and I'll show you what I've used for my fillers and primers. But once I've put the filler in, sanded, once I've then sprayed it with spray putty, sanded, done that 2 or 3 times, and then I've primed it, what I like to then do is go in with one of these scouring pads. And I have them at different gauges, and I go in on them. And what that does is it just gives the 3D printed part a really nice shine, lovely surface to then put your paint on, whatever paint that you're using. I'm obviously whites and blues for R2, but using these little scouring pads, what that gets me is a shinier surface. What I also then do once I've done that is I take some of this blue roll and I then wipe everything down and essentially use this like a buffing cloth, and I use it just to buff the surface of the 3D print. What that then, so sorry RT, what that then does is it just gives me a surface that's nice, it's clean, but it's also perfect then for the paint, because there's no dust on there. But what you also done, you've slightly polished it, which means it's already shiny, slightly shiny. The some people I know, they will do a little wet sand at this point. It was basically doing something very similar, but I'm kind of buffing that primer layer, and then they're ready to paint with the white paint, and that's been giving me a really lovely surface. Now, my R2, when he's done, is not going to be clean. He's going to be very dirty and weathered. But I did want to make sure that I had a really nice white, clean, obviously all print lines gone, all of that jazz. I really wanted to work hard on making this look as good as I could do it. So there you go. So that's the tools that I have been using. Let's talk about paints. 3 cans of paint here to talk through. The first one is, I've mentioned this before, just spray putty. I found a company online that were just selling these for £5 a can. Everywhere, every country's got a slightly different option, but this spray putty is brilliant. Now, what I do is I tend to put quite a thick layer on first, just let it soak into the surface, and then I'll go in with some sandpaper, knock it down and give it another spray of spray putty. Now, if I pre-sanded the piece with some rough sandpaper, I find that I need to use less of this stuff. So early sanding actually allows me to use less spray putty. Once it's all spray puttied and done, and the filler is on there as well, I'm just using a basic primer. I prime it. I then will give it a sand with those scouring pads. I might give it another prime then. I then sand it with the scouring pad. So I've got 2 layers there. So it's nicely covered. I'll then go in with the the blue paper just to kind of polish it up one more time. Once I've then painted it, what I've been doing is all of the parts, including the blue parts and the white, I've been then covering it with this clear gloss finish. The white that I used was a satin. I don't want an overly shiny R2. Don't want a shiny R2 at all. This is a clear gloss finish, crystal clear. Now, my experience of this stuff is this particular brand isn't that gloss. It acts more like a satin when it's on, and it's on here, and it's definitely a satin. It's not a gloss finish. Just enough to seal that white paint so that when I then go in to do all my weathering, it's going to be sat on that clear coat. And it does help me putting my oils and my watercolours in as I start doing some of that weathering, and it allows me to kind of pull it off as well. So that's what I've been using for the paints. Let's talk about runs for a moment. You will get runs, not the runs, but you will get runs, and it will frustrate you no end. When you're painting something of this scale, you want thin layer, thin layer, thin layer, thin layer. Let it dry in between, and then you'll suddenly notice there's a patch that's not being covered very well. So you'll go in a little bit too confident. The next thing you know, I've got to run. And you'll be frustrated with yourself that you've then got to run, but don't panic. Some very easy things that you could do. And what I've been finding is with my sanding pads, once that paint is really dry, I've been going in with a 40 grit sanding pad, which, sorry, not 40 grit. I've been going in with a 240 grit sanding pad, which is very fine. And I've lightly been going in there and lightly sanding. I've been, you wait a number of days, wait for it to really, really, really dry. Then you go in, you sand it. And I had some really bad runs around this area here that was really irritating me. And I was able to go in, sand those runs away. And what I actually found was because I wasn't sanding too deeply, I actually didn't take away too much of the paint that I didn't want to take away. So I then went in with another light spray after that, and you can't see those runs are there at all. Now, if you're dealing with a run that's going into one of the recesses, then you're going to need to use the tools to kind of clear it out. And what I would suggest is clearing it out before it dries too much. So if it's a run in one of the recesses, you can go in with a tool, just clean it out, and then you can deal with the run around, when it's completely and utterly dry. So that's process, that's paints, that's runs. And the final thing, what I would say is, the big win, particularly on the silver parts, is just to keep using rub and buff. A lot of us are using rub and buff on the domes. You want to be using rub and buff on all of your silver parts. It just makes a big difference. Now, all these bits are not glued in right now. They're kind of placed in there as I'm working on R2. I won't glue them in right until the very end. I'll screw them in right until the very end. But what I wanted to do is start putting some of these in place so I could actually start to see what R2 was starting to look like. So that's an update on general painting and the process of cleaning up your 3D prints. What I would say is, and my 3D printer is going, you probably heard it going in the background, it's just living with me at the moment printing. What I would say is that it's better to print things for a longer period of time and have less work to do than rushing the print and having more work to do. Unless you love sanding, print at a higher quality, just let the printer do its job. You will come home and your print will be done. Just take time to print things well. If you rush prints, they're just not going to turn out as well, and you're going to have problems when it comes to doing cleanup. Because no matter how hard you work on cleanup of 3D parts, you are always going to end up with those lines unless you really go above and beyond. So there you go. That's where R2 is up to right now. I hope you found that interesting. As Are you building an R2? I would love to see, if you're on Instagram or anything like that, let me know, put some little comments in the notes. I'd love to see where you're up to or what your R2 looks like. I would be really, really interested. Now, if you've done any cleanup on 3D printing parts that's different to this, I'd love to hear. Now, I know some of you use electrical tools, orbital sanders, that kind of stuff. I've kept away from all of that because I didn't want to burn the plant. If that's spinning too fast, you can just end up with the top surfaces of your 3D print completely burnt. So I've kind of warned away from that. But if you've got any particular tools that you think is really helpful, I would love to hear from you. Leave me a comment. Do like the videos, do subscribe and all of that jazz. Until next time, have a great time making and cosplaying, and we'll catch up with you soon.